This is the first video lecture on the chapter Personality, which is chapter 12 in your textbook. I will be sharing my screen so that we can follow along with the chapter outline. Okay, let me get everything situated here. All right, so personality is probably what a lot of people think of when they think of psychology. Is considered or is defined as patterns of thoughts, behaviors, and usually emotional expression that are generally consistent across time and place. So these are patterns of your behavior that have sort of remained consistent over the course of your lifetime and are consistent when you are with your friends or when you are at home. They are not, so one thing to stress is that there is some predictability, but we're talking about average behaviors. In this chapter, we're going to talk about some different theories about personality. We'll start with some of the Freudian theories, and then we'll move into some neo-Freudian, and by neo-Freudian, they mean that they hold some of the similar characteristics as Freud's theories, some humanist theories, social cognitive theories, and then finally some trait theories. So you may remember we talked about Freud earlier in the semester, way back to, oh gosh, he's come up on and off throughout the semester. And one of the things, so Freud's big takeaway, and this was on your midterm exam and it'll be on the final, is what aspect of Freud's theory remains consistent and or is still with us today. And the right answer to that is his emphasis on the subconscious, right? So the notion that there is something below your conscious awareness that continues to influence your behavior, that's really what we mean by psychoanalytical. The neo-Freudians, what they have in common is this emphasis on the subconscious, but there's a little bit different. So Freud's theory about personality was what was called a psychosexual theory about personality. But I think that's actually on the next slide. So first of all, let's back up. So personality, from the things that control or what influences our behavior, is thought of, according to Freud, as having these three pieces or these three structures of personality. And in the modules, there's actually a video clip that explains these better than I can. And I actually found that video clip many semesters ago, and it was very useful for me to understand. But the idea is that, just to refresh your memory, is that our personality has these three elements. You have the id, which is sort of like the devil, right? This is the id, and it wants what it wants now. It wants immediate gratification. It's usually sexual in nature or aggressive in nature. You have the superego, which is like the angel on your on your shoulder. So you can imagine that metaphor. You have the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. But it's the ego, and so this is this word that gets thrown around a lot in our culture. The ego is what's responsible for balancing these desires of the id, the animal desires of the id, and the conscience or the rule-following aspects of the superego. So sometimes a good way to think of it is the superego is like a superhero. So the ego is the reality. What we see it played out in our behavior, that's the ego, but it's trying to balance these two tensions. One of the Freudian theory, it's actually on this one, and according to Freud's theory, anxiety, when we're suffering from anxiety, is because that id, now the ego, the part that's supposed to control the two, it's worried or that it's a fear it's going to lose control over the balance between the ego, the angel and the devil. So that's what anxiety is when one of these aspects of our personality is going to dominate. And how we deal with these anxieties, terms like so much of Freud's terminology continues to spill out in our pop culture, but we establish or we create defense mechanisms as a way of dealing with our anxiety, as a way of dealing with this fear. And one defense mechanism is sort of to shut down the id, right? And we repress it. So the idea is that we repress all the desires of that angel that's sitting on our shoulder. But sometimes when we repress too much, parts of the desires of the id will spill out. And this is what we call a Freudian slip. So when we laugh at something that's not funny, when we call someone the wrong name, and the idea is that those slips, that's really what we desire. That's really how we feel. But because these are defense mechanisms associated with anxiety, but because the ego, I always get them confused, I have to think about them, but because the ego is losing this battle to balance the superego and the id, that those things kind of get past the ego. I hope that makes some sense. Development from the Freudian model moves in these stages, and the stages are associated with what he called the psychosexual stages of personality development. And these stages are associated with where we're getting pleasure, right? So another important concept is this idea of a pleasure principle. And so let me explain what I mean by these stages, and then I'll come back to it. But our personality evolves, or it develops, as we move through these various stages in life. The first stage for somebody who is under the age of 1 is referred to as the oral stage. And the idea is that in the oral stage, right, in the oral stage, children are learning about their world, they're learning about pleasure, everything is through their mouth. So they put everything in their mouth, right? And depending on how well this need for pleasure is dealt with in the oral stage, if they get too much or too little pleasure from the oral stage, or any of these stages, they become fixated. I'll get back to that. The next stage, so after, if you've ever been around small children, you know they put everything in their mouth, right? Well, between 1 and 3, this is when a child, I think there's another video that I'll cue you for this one that kind of explains it too. But between 1 and 3, when a child is really spending a lot of attention on their bowels, because there's a lot of talk about potty training, there's a lot of diapering that's going on, right? This is the anal stage. And again, depending if you've ever heard of the term anal retentive or anal expulsive. And depending on how well a person transitions through this stage of their anal psychosexual development, they can become fixated, they can get stuck there. And if they're stuck in their anal stage, which kind of implies um, that they continue to get a lot of pleasure, or there's a lot of tension associated with their anal sphincter, right? They can either be what's called anal retentive, which is kind of uptight, right? And that's an anal retentive person is characterized as being uptight and maybe very tidy, or they can be anal expulsive. An anal expulsive person is somebody who's like a slob, right? But the point is that you have to transition through each of these stages in a successfully, a little bit like Erickson. Oh wait, that's human development. I'm sorry, because there's another theory, but you have to transition through each of these stages. Then we move to the phallic stage, and the phallic stage would be like 3 to 6, and kids really, according to the Freudian theory, they get fixated on and one of the criticisms about Freud's theories has been there's too much emphasis on males and male genitalia, right? So the idea here is that they get fixated on penises. And it's during this stage that a child begins to recognizes that boys have penises and girls don't. And this is where some of the other stuff like the Oedipus and the Electra complex start showing up, where boys get in competition with their fathers for the attention of their mothers. And so you have preschool boys who will say things like, I'm going to grow up and marry my mom. And they get jealous when their dad is kissing their mom, and they start, according to Freud, they start sort of plotting for the destruction of their father so that they can gain their mother's full attention. They fear that their father is going to castrate them. So if you've ever heard the phrase castration anxiety, right? And so it becomes really competitive in this sort of period of time. Now, sort of after the fact, when, there was a discussion about girls, and that's where you get the Electra complex. I'm not read up on the Electra complex. I don't recall if it's that girls are fearful of their mothers. I believe girls are fearful of their mothers because they want the sexual attention of their fathers. fathers, right? And so it's through this period that we also experience what's called identification, where little girls recognize that their bodies are like their mothers, and so they begin to act like their mothers, and little boys recognize that their bodies are like their fathers, and they begin to act like their fathers. Okay? The next stage, 7 to 11, is called the latency period, where according to Freudian personality development people, there really is no interest in, there's no sexual energy. We start focusing on our same-sex friends. And then when we get to adolescence, this is the genital period, and this is when we are completely consumed by our sexual desires. Another criticism of Freud's theory is the assumption is that at adolescence you are considered a fully sexually mature adult, and most other psychologists would argue that that's not a fair. Your body might be fully sexualized, but not necessarily your mind. So anyway, but this is your personality. Personality development comes out of these stages, and and so if you get stuck in one of these stages, if you're fixated, that's going to influence your behavior. I'm going to stop right here because this is the 10-minute mark, and when I come back, we'll talk about the neo-Freudians, or the new Freudian scholars. Maybe.